My name is Rashid Malik. I am 28 years old, and on August 3rd, 2019, my life was turned upside down in a way I never imagined possible. That night, while alone in a hotel room in Istanbul, far from my family in Pakistan, Jesus Christ revealed himself to me in such a powerful way that he broke all the chains that had bound me for almost 3 decades. Today, as I speak to you from a safe place where I have built a new life, I need to share what God can do even when everything seems lost and when following the truth means losing everything you know. I was born in Lahore, Pakistan in 1991 into a family known throughout our community as guardians of the Islamic faith. My father, Imran Malik, was not only a devout Muslim, he was a respected Imam who led one of the largest mosques in the city. Our house was literally next to the mosque, and the sound of prayers echoed through the walls of my room from the moment I first opened my eyes in this world. My earliest memories are of my father teaching me to pronounce words in Arabic before I could even form complete sentences in Urdu. He held my small hands, positioned my fingers, and guided me through the movements of Islamic prayer while I still needed help to stand on my own. Faith was not just a part of our lives, it was the air we breathed, the water we drank, the very essence of who we were as a family. Growing up as the son of an imam meant living under a constant microscope. My every action was observed by the community, every word weighed, every behavior judged as a reflection not only of my family, but of the very religion my father represented. When I was only 5 years old, I was already memorizing verses from the Quran in Arabic, a language I didn't understand, but which I repeated perfectly because the punishment for error was severe and immediate. My father believed that the body needed to feel pain so that the soul could learn obedience. So when I stumbled over words or forgot a passage during our nightly study sessions, he would use a thin bamboo stick on my back until tears prevented me from continuing. Then he would hug me and say that it was love, that Allah was molding me through discipline, that I should be grateful for having a father who cared enough about my eternal soul to correct my temporary flesh. Our family was large and rigidly structured. My mother Aisha was a quiet woman who rarely raised her eyes when men were present. She gave me 3 younger brothers, Ahmad, Hassan, and Bilal, and 2 sisters, Fatima and Zainab, who were kept separate from us boys as soon as they reached puberty. The house was divided into male and female sections, and my mother and sisters lived in a part I rarely visited after I turned 12. They wore full burqas even indoors when visitors came, and I grew up understanding that women were heavy responsibilities who needed to be protected and controlled because their nature was weak and prone to sin. My father preached this from the pulpit every Friday, and I saw it demonstrated in every interaction within our home. When Fatima, my older sister, was caught smiling at a distant cousin during a family wedding, she was kept out of the house for 6 whole months as punishment. And at 16 she was married to a 45-year-old man whom my father chose because he was pious and could keep her in line. My father's mosque attracted hundreds of worshipers every week, and from childhood I was placed in a leadership position among the young people. At 10, I was already leading prayer groups for boys my age. At 13, I was teaching Islamic studies classes to younger children. At 15, my father began taking me on his trips to other mosques, where he was invited to preach, introducing me as his successor, the future religious leader who would continue his legacy. The pride in his eyes at those moments was the only approval I sought in life, the only validation that truly mattered. I shaped my entire existence around being worthy of that look of satisfaction that rarely appeared, but which meant I was on the right path, that Allah was pleased with me through my father's satisfaction. The 5 daily prayers completely structured my day. I would wake before dawn for Fajr, interrupt my studies at midday for Dhuhr, pause any afternoon activities for Asr, watch the sunset during Maghrib, and end each day with Isha before sleep. Each prayer was preceded by a purification ritual, washing specific parts of the body in a precise sequence, removing any physical impurity before presenting myself before Allah. The routine was as automatic as breathing, but even as a child I perceived that there was something mechanical about those movements. I recited the words in Arabic, bowed my body towards Mecca, touched my forehead to the prayer rug hundreds of times a week, but my heart remained strangely distant from it all. It was like watching myself through a glass, performing a role I had memorized perfectly, but never truly inhabited. During Ramadan, the holy month of fasting, our family became even more rigorous. From dawn to sunset, nothing touched our lips, neither food nor water, even when temperatures in Lahore exceeded 40 degrees, and sweat dripped down my face as I studied religious texts in Arabic that I could barely understand. My father said that hunger brought us closer to Allah, that physical suffering purified the soul, that denying the body nourished the spirit. I believed him because I had no reason to doubt, because everyone around me believed the same things, because questioning these truths would be questioning the very structure of the reality that had surrounded me since birth. But sometimes, late at night, after breaking my fast and eating until I felt sick, because my shrunken stomach couldn't process the amount of food I desperately stuffed into it, I wondered why Allah needed me to suffer to prove my love. If he was all-powerful and knew all things, why did he need such elaborate demonstrations of devotion? At 16, I was sent to a madrasa in Peshawar, an Islamic religious school where young men underwent intensive training in theology and Sharia law. My father had studied at the same institution decades earlier, and he told me that those 3 years would be the most important in my formation as a religious leader. The madrasa was a walled complex where over 300 students lived in cramped dormitories, woke at 4 in the morning for prayer, studied religious texts for 12 hours a day, and were severely punished for any deviation from the strict rules that governed every aspect of our lives. We had no access to television, the internet, music, or any form of entertainment that could distract our minds from the study of Allah. Our world shrank to fit within those walls, and all that existed was the Quran, the Hadiths, the teachings of the Imams, and the constant repetition that we were the chosen ones, the pure ones, those who would understand the true path while the rest of the world was lost in darkness and corruption. The teachers at the madrasa were stern men who saw any sign of individuality or questioning as a threat that needed to be eliminated. When one of my classmates asked why Allah allowed so much suffering in the world, if he was merciful and all-powerful, he was beaten in front of the whole class as an example. The teacher shouted that questioning Allah was the first step towards apostasy, that doubts were planted by Satan, that our responsibility was to completely subdue our minds and hearts without allowing the poison of independent thought to contaminate our pure faith. I watched that classmate being dragged out of the classroom with blood running from his nose, and I learned that day that some questions were too dangerous to be verbalized, even when they screamed inside my head during the silent hours of the night. During those 3 years in Peshawar, I memorized the entire Quran in Arabic. All 114 surahs, more than 6,000 verses, every word etched into my mind through tireless repetition until I could recite entire passages without consciously thinking about them. It was an achievement my whole family celebrated, and my father wept with pride when I returned home as a Hafiz, a guardian of the Quran, one of the few who had reached this mark of supreme dedication. He told me that Allah had especially blessed me, that I was destined for great things, that my ability to memorize the sacred words was a sign that I was chosen for leadership. But even as he embraced me and tears of joy streamed down his face, I felt that familiar emptiness expanding within me. I had memorized thousands of verses, but I didn't truly understand most of them because they were in Arabic, and we only memorized the sounds without always grasping the meanings. I could recite the entire Quran, but I couldn't honestly say that those words had touched my heart in any profound or transformative way. At 19, I began taking on teaching responsibilities at my father's mosque. I led prayers, taught classes for young people, visited families for religious counseling, and gradually became known in the community as a promising young Imam who would follow in the footsteps of his respected father. People treated me with a deference I didn't feel I deserved, touched my feet as a sign of respect, asked for my blessings, sought my guidance on matters of faith and life. And I played the role perfectly, offering answers I had memorized, quoting verses appropriate to each situation, maintaining the serious expression and dignified posture expected of a religious leader. But inside, the feeling of emptiness only grew. I was giving people answers from a book I myself didn't fully understand, offering certainties about a God who seemed increasingly distant and incomprehensible to me. The first major crack in my faith came when I was 21, when I witnessed something that changed how I saw everything. A man from our community was accused of blasphemy because he had supposedly said something disrespectful about the Prophet Muhammad during a heated argument. I wasn't present when it happened, so I don't know if the accusation was true or false. But I knew the man, a poor laborer who repaired bicycles near the market and always greeted me respectfully when I passed by. News of the accusation spread through the community like wildfire, and within hours a mob had gathered outside his house. My father was at the front of that mob, leading the shouts that the blasphemer needed to be punished, that Allah's law demanded death for anyone who insulted the Prophet, that allowing such a person to live would be treason against the faith. I stood on the edge of that mob watching as they broke down the door of the house, dragged the screaming man into the street, and began to beat him while his wife and children cried and begged for mercy. What happened in the next few hours was so brutal that it still makes me shudder when I think about it. The mob, fueled by religious fury and my father's leadership, beat that man until he was barely recognizable as a human being. They didn't stop when he lost consciousness. They didn't stop when blood pooled on the ground around him. They continued kicking his inert body while shouting Allahu Akbar and praising the Prophet whose name they believed they were upholding. And when they finally finished, when the man was clearly dead, covered in blood, and with broken bones protruding through his torn skin, the crowd dispersed as if they had just performed a sacred service. My father returned home, performed his ritual ablutions, and led the afternoon prayer as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But something inside me had broken irreparably that afternoon. I had seen the face of Allah that my father preached about, the God who demanded blood in exchange for words, the God whose honor was so fragile that it required a mob of men beating a poor worker to death to defend it. That night, for the first time in my life, I couldn't finish my prayers. I knelt on my rug, turned my face toward Mecca, and began to recite the familiar words, but they died in my throat because I could no longer pretend I was speaking to a God of mercy when I had just witnessed his most devout followers display cruelty that made me feel physically ill. My father noticed my hesitation and asked if something was wrong, and I said I was just tired. But the truth was that for the first time I was truly seeing what had always been before me. The God I had served my whole life was a God who inspired fear and violence, who turned people into bloodthirsty mobs, who justified brutality in the name of religious honor, and I began to wonder if this could truly be the real God, or if there was something fundamentally wrong with everything I had been taught to believe. The following years were a painful exercise in living a double life. Outwardly, I continued to be the devout son of the Imam, the promising young religious leader, the respected Hafiz, who could recite the entire Quran from memory. Inwardly, I was drowning in doubts that grew heavier and more impossible to ignore each day. I began to notice patterns I had never questioned before. The way the women in my family were treated as property, their entire lives controlled by men who decided what they could wear, who they could talk to, where they could go. The way my father preached love and mercy from the pulpit, but then came home and beat my mother for transgressions as minor as burning the rice, or not having his favorite clothes clean when he wanted to wear them. The way the entire structure of our community was built on rigid hierarchies of power, where questioning religious leaders was equivalent to questioning Allah, where blind obedience was considered the greatest virtue, where thinking for oneself was seen as the first step towards hell. At 24, my father began arranging my marriage. The chosen bride was the daughter of another Imam, a 16-year-old girl I had never met, but whom my father assured me was perfectly trained in the responsibilities of wife and mother. He showed me a single photograph of her, completely covered except for her eyes, and told me that the wedding would take place in 6 months, that she would give me many children, that I would establish my own family, and eventually take over the mosque completely when he retired. The idea of marrying a child I didn't know, of consummating this marriage when she was too young to truly consent to anything, of perpetuating the same cycle of control and repression that had marked my entire life, all of this filled me with a nausea I couldn't completely hide. My father noticed my lack of enthusiasm and reprimanded me for being ungrateful, reminding me that arranged marriages were the proper Islamic way, that romantic love was a corrupt Western concept that led to immorality, and that my only responsibility was to obey his wisdom just as he obeyed the will of Allah. It was during this period of inner turmoil that I received the offer that would change everything. A distant cousin who worked in import, and export invited me to accompany him on a business trip to Istanbul. He needed someone who could help him negotiate with Turkish suppliers, and he thought my education and fluency in Arabic would be useful. My father initially hesitated to let me go, worried that Turkey, with its secularism and Western influences, might corrupt my faith. But my cousin assured me that we would stay in appropriate hotels, attend local mosques, and that I would be back in 2 weeks, well before my wedding date. Reluctantly, my father agreed, probably seeing this as my last opportunity for some freedom before assuming the responsibilities of husband and eventual mosque leader. Istanbul was a culture shock I wasn't prepared to process. The city was a world entirely different from Lahore, a chaotic mix of East and West, of tradition and modernity, of ancient mosques alongside nightclubs, of women wearing hijabs walking alongside women in modern Western clothing. For the first time in my life, I saw Muslims living in ways my father had said were impossible, that were betrayals of the faith. I saw Muslim families where husbands and wives walked side by side as equals, where women worked in shops and offices, where people practiced their religion without the suffocating weight of rules governing every aspect of life, and I realized that the Islam I had encountered in Lahore was just one interpretation, a particularly strict version of a faith that other people lived in completely different ways. On our 5th night in Istanbul, my cousin went out for a business dinner, and I was alone in my hotel room for the first time since we'd arrived. I turned on the television and started flipping through channels, something I rarely did at home where our access to media was strictly controlled. I stopped on a channel broadcasting a debate about religion, and something about the discussion caught my attention. One of the debaters was a former Muslim who had converted to Christianity, and he was explaining why he had left Islam. Every word he said resonated with the secret doubts I had carried for years, the questions I had never dared to verbalize, the internal conflicts I thought were merely my personal weaknesses. He spoke about how the Islam he had known was built on fear and control, about how he had sought mercy and love in Allah, but found only demands and threats, about how discovering Jesus Christ had been like seeing light for the first time after living in a dark cave his whole life. I turned off the television, my hands trembling, my heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood pulsing in my ears. What I had just watched was profoundly dangerous. In Pakistan, apostasy, leaving Islam, was a crime punishable by death. Even watching such a program could be considered flirting with blasphemy. But something had been triggered within me, a thirst I didn't know existed, a hunger for answers to questions I had stifled for years. I picked up my phone and, my hand still trembling, typed in search terms I never imagined I would. Why do people leave Islam? The results that appeared led me down a rabbit hole that consumed the next 3 hours. I read testimonies from former Muslims around the world, their stories echoing elements of my own experience, the feeling of emptiness during prayers, the confusion about why Allah seemed so distant and severe, the struggle to reconcile teachings on mercy with the realities of violence and control that were justified in the name of religion. Some of these testimonies mentioned how they had found peace and purpose in other faiths, particularly Christianity. They described Jesus not as a minor prophet in the Islamic pantheon, but as God incarnate who had offered salvation through love and sacrifice instead of demanding submission through fear and obedience. The idea was so radically different from anything I had known that it seemed almost absurd, but at the same time, something deep within me recognized truth in those words. I closed the browser and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind was racing with thoughts that were simultaneously liberating and terrifying. What if everything I'd been taught was wrong? What if the true God wasn't the stern and distant Allah of my prayers, but the loving and close Jesus these people testified about? What if my entire life up to that point had been based on an elaborate lie, a structure of control and fear disguised as divine truth? But then I thought of my father, my family, my community, everything I would lose if I followed these questions to their logical conclusions. I thought of the 16-year-old bride who was expecting to marry me in a few weeks, the mosque I was destined to lead, the legacy I was expected to continue. The weight of these expectations was overwhelming, but for the first time, the weight of my doubts was even heavier. On my 6th night in Istanbul, after another day of business meetings where I feigned interest but couldn't stop thinking about what I'd discovered the previous night, I returned to my hotel room and did something that would have been unthinkable days before. I searched for an Arabic Bible online and began reading the Gospel of John. The first word struck me like lightning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The concept of God becoming human flesh, of descending to the level of his creatures, not through intermediary prophets but personally, was so radically different from the distant monotheism of Islam that it seemed almost heretical. But I kept reading, unable to stop even knowing that every word was potentially dangerous for my future, my family, my own life. As I read about Jesus healing the sick, defending the marginalized, challenging hypocritical religious authorities, eating with sinners and prostitutes, touching the untouchables, something within me began to awaken. This Jesus was so different from the Prophet Muhammad I knew through the Hadiths. Muhammad had been a warrior and political leader who established a kingdom through military conquest and political power. Jesus had been a carpenter who rejected earthly power and taught about a spiritual kingdom that came through inner transformation. Muhammad had had multiple wives, including a 9-year-old girl. Jesus never married and treated women with radical dignity for his time. Muhammad had ordered the death of his critics and established detailed laws to govern every aspect of life. Jesus had preached forgiveness even for those who crucified him and taught that the greatest commandment was to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. I read until 3 a.m, absorbing every word of the Gospel of John until I reach the end, where Jesus appears to the disciples after the resurrection and tells the doubting Thomas to touch his wounds. The idea of God willingly suffering and dying for the love of humanity, instead of demanding sacrifices and submission from humanity, was so moving that tears began to stream down my face. For the first time in my life, I was encountering a God who truly seemed to be love, not just claiming to be merciful while inspiring fear, but demonstrating love through self-sacrifice. The contrast with the Allah I knew, the God whose mercy was always conditional on perfect obedience, whose love needed to be earned through ritual and submission, was so striking that it made me question everything. I knelt beside my hotel bed that night, but not to perform my regular Islamic prayers. For the first time in my life, I spoke to God not through memorized Arabic recitations, but with my own words in Urdu, my mother tongue. God, I whispered, I don't know if you are Allah or Jesus or something completely different from what I've been taught, but if you are real, if you truly care about people like me who are lost and confused, I need you to show me the truth. I've spent my whole life trying to please you through prayers and fasting and memorization, but I've never felt you close to me. If Jesus is who these people say he is, if you truly descended from heaven to reach us instead of making us climb up to you, then please show it to me in a way that I cannot deny or ignore. I am willing to lose everything if it means finding the truth, but I need to know that it is truly the truth and not just another comfortable lie. What happened in the next few hours is difficult to describe in a way that makes sense to someone who hasn't experienced it. I fell asleep in that kneeling position beside the bed, emotionally exhausted from the intensity of the last 2 nights, and then I had a dream that was unlike any dream I'd ever had before. It was so vivid, so real, that when I woke up, I couldn't be sure if it had been a dream or a vision or something in between. In the dream, I was back in Lahore, standing in the crowd that had killed that man accused of blasphemy years ago. But this time, instead of standing on the edge watching in horror, I was in the center of the crowd, and they were coming for me. My father led the shouts, pointing at me as a traitor and an apostate, and I knew with absolute certainty that they were going to kill me in the same brutal way they had killed that poor worker. But then, just as the hands of the crowd were about to grab me, a light shone so brightly that everyone had to cover their eyes. And in the midst of that light was a man I immediately recognized as Jesus, though I had never seen an image of him before that moment. He said nothing, but extended his hand toward me, and when I took his hand, the furious crowd simply vanished. We were alone, he and I felt a sense of peace and security I had never experienced in my entire life. It was like coming home after being lost for years, like being embraced by a loving father after spending a lifetime trying to gain approval from an abusive father. And then he spoke, and his voice was simultaneously gentle and powerful. Rashid, you have been looking for me in all the wrong places. I have been waiting for you your whole life. Come and follow me, and I will show you who you truly are. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding, tears streaming down my face, and with absolute certainty that I had just experienced something supernatural. Sunlight was beginning to stream through the hotel room window, and I could hear the morning call to Islamic prayer from a nearby mosque. It was Fajr prayer time, the ritual I had performed thousands of times in my life. But that morning, instead of automatically grabbing my prayer rug and turning towards Mecca, I simply knelt where I was and spoke to Jesus. I don't know if you are really God, I began, but the dream I just had was unlike anything I've ever experienced. If it was you showing me the truth, then I want to follow you. But I need more than a dream. I need something concrete, something that shows me with certainty that taking this step isn't just exchanging one prison for another. The answer came in a way I hadn't expected. My cousin knocked on my bedroom door a few minutes later, saying that the business trip had concluded earlier than expected and that we would be returning to Lahore in 2 days instead of a week. What should have been normal news filled me with panic because I realized that time was running out. If I returned to Pakistan without clarity on these issues consuming my mind, I would be dragged back into the life that had been planned for me. I would marry that 16-year-old girl in a few weeks, assume my responsibilities as a young Imam, and spend the rest of my life preaching a faith I no longer believed in, perpetuating a cycle of control and fear that I was finally seeing for what it truly was. That day, while my cousin was in a final business meeting, I slipped out of the hotel and began wandering the streets of Istanbul without a specific destination. My legs carried me through bustling markets, past historic mosques, along the Bosphorus where boats glided over shimmering water under the afternoon sun, and eventually, almost as if guided by an unseen force, I found myself before a small but beautiful Christian church, with a simple cross above the entrance. I had never been inside a church in my life. In Pakistan, churches were places we avoided, markers of where the minority Christian community gathered. People who were often treated as second-class citizens under a political system dominated by Islamic values. My father had preached that churches were places of false worship where people wrongly deified man and committed shirk, the unforgivable sin of associating partners with Allah. But something stronger than years of conditioning pushed me through that door. The interior of the church was quiet and serene, a modest space with simple wooden pews and a stained glass window showing Jesus with open arms. There was only one person there, an older man kneeling in prayer near the front. I sat on a pew in the back, having no idea what I should be doing in a Christian place of worship, simply absorbing the atmosphere, which was so different from the mosques I knew. There was no loud call to prayer, no segregation between men and women, no elaborate display of ritual, just quiet, and a sense of presence that felt inviting rather than demanding. The older man eventually finished his prayer and turned around, noticing my presence for the first time. He walked over to where I was sitting and asked in Turkish if I needed help. I replied in broken English that I was a visitor from Pakistan, and his face lit up with recognition. "Ah," he said, switching to English with a heavy accent. "So you're Muslim. Welcome to our church. It's rare for us to have Muslim visitors. Is there something specific that brought you here?" I didn't know how to answer that question honestly, without revealing all the confusion and crisis that was going on inside me. So I simply said, "I'm searching for God, and I don't know where else to find him." The old man, who introduced himself as Pastor Mehmet, sat beside me, and we began to talk. He didn't try to convert me or give me easy answers. He simply listened as I poured out my entire story. The doubts I had carried for years, the violence I had witnessed in the name of religion, the emptiness I felt despite all my devotion and religious knowledge, the dream I had the previous night about Jesus rescuing me from an angry mob. He listened to everything without interrupting, his eyes full of compassion that made me feel seen and understood for the first time in my life. When I finally finished speaking, he remained silent for a long moment before responding. "Rashid," he finally said, "sounds like you've spent your whole life trying to reach a God who always remains distant, always demanding more, never satisfied with your efforts. It's exhausting, isn't it? Trying to earn love that's never guaranteed, seeking mercy that's always conditional on perfect performance." I nodded, unable to speak because of the lump in my throat. He continued, "The central message of Christianity is exactly the opposite of that. Jesus taught that God isn't waiting for us to reach out to him through our efforts. Instead, he came down to us through Jesus Christ. God's love isn't something we earn through prayers or fasting or good works. It's a free gift offered to all who simply accept it. Jesus already did the work on the cross. Our part is simply to receive what he offers." The words were simple, but they struck a chord deep within me. My whole life had been about striving, about trying to be good enough, about hoping my devotion would be accepted by a distant God who seemed impossible to please. The idea that God could simply love me without demanding that I prove my worth first was so radically different from anything I had known that it seemed too good to be true. Pastor Mehmet must have seen the doubt on my face, because he smiled gently and said, "I know it sounds strange when you come from a background where God's love is always connected to obedience and performance, but let me read something to you." He picked up the Bible that was on the bench next to us and opened it to a passage he clearly knew well. He began to read in English, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him." He closed the Bible and looked at me. "Do you see the difference, Rashid? God didn't send Jesus to give us more rules to follow or more rituals to perform. He came to save us, to rescue us, to offer us relationship instead of religion. Your dream last night, where Jesus rescued you from the crowd, that wasn't just a random dream. It was God showing you exactly what He wants to do in your life, rescue you from a system that is destroying your soul. What? We sat together in that church for another 2 hours while Pastor Mehmet patiently answered my questions and helped me understand the fundamentals of the Christian faith. He explained the Trinity in a way that made sense. Not three gods as I had been taught Christians believed, but one God who revealed Himself in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He explained that salvation didn't come through following 5 pillars or performing religious rituals, but through simply trusting in Jesus Christ and receiving the forgiveness and new life He offers. He was honest about the fact that following Jesus has real costs, especially for someone in my position, but he was also clear that a relationship with the true God was worth any necessary sacrifice. When I finally left that church as the sun was setting over Istanbul, my whole world had changed. I hadn't made any final decisions yet, but I knew for sure that I couldn't go back to Lahore and continue living the lie my life had become. I couldn't marry that girl. I couldn't lead my father's mosque. I couldn't spend the rest of my days preaching Allah while my heart was increasingly drawn to Jesus. The cost of following that attraction would be immense, probably meaning losing everything and everyone I knew, perhaps even my own life if Pakistan's apostasy laws were enforced. But for the first time in my life, I was considering that there are things more important than security and comfort, that finding truth might be worth any price. On my last night in Istanbul, August 3, 2019, I returned to that small hotel room and made the most important choice of my life. I knelt beside the bed once more, but this time not as a confused Muslim seeking answers. I spoke directly to Jesus, using His own words that I had read in the Gospel of John. Jesus, I am like that blind man you healed who didn't know exactly who you were, but simply said, I was blind, but now I see. I don't understand everything about Christian theology or the Trinity or all the doctrinal details, but I clearly see that you are different from the Allah I have known my whole life. You offer love instead of demanding obedience. You came to us instead of making us climb up to you. You died for me instead of demanding that I live in fear of you. I believe that you are the true God, and I want to follow you no matter what it costs. The moment I finished that prayer, something extraordinary happened. A feeling of peace descended upon me that was as tangible as physical weight being lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in my memory, there was no voice of my father in my head telling me I wasn't good enough. There was no fear of punishment for failing to perform rituals perfectly. There was no overwhelming sense of obligation to earn God's favor through tireless religious performance. There was only stillness, peace, a profound sense of being known and loved unconditionally. I began to cry, not from sadness, but from relief, years of tension and fear melting away as I experienced for the first time what it meant to be completely accepted by God who didn't require me to prove my worth first. I knew at that moment that there was no going back. I couldn't return to Pakistan and pretend nothing had changed. I couldn't marry that girl and build a life based on lies. I couldn't stand before the congregation at my father's mosque and preach a faith I no longer believed in. But I also knew that returning and announcing my conversion would be a virtual death sentence. Pakistan's blasphemy laws are notoriously severe, and apostasy, leaving Islam, is considered one of the worst possible crimes. So I made a decision that would completely change the course of my life. I wouldn't go back home. In the hours before our scheduled flight back to Lahore, I messaged Pastor Mehmet explaining my situation. He replied immediately, saying he knew people who worked with religious refugees and could help me. I told my cousin I was feeling too ill to fly and needed to see a doctor, and when he went to the hospital with me out of politeness, I slipped out the back exit with a small bag containing my passport and the little money I had. I disappeared into the streets of Istanbul as the person I had been, and when I emerged days later through the support network Pastor Mehmet had connected, I was a completely new person. The following months were simultaneously the most difficult and liberating of my life. The Christian Support Network connected me with a shelter for religious refugees, where I met other former Muslims who had taken a similar step of following Jesus despite the consequences. Their stories were all different, but the themes were the same: the search for the true God, disillusionment with Islam, a supernatural encounter with Jesus, and the decision to follow the truth no matter the cost. For the first time, I was not alone on my journey. I was surrounded by people who understood exactly what I had gone through, the inner struggle, the fear of the consequences, but also the indescribable joy of finally knowing God personally. On October 15, 2019, 2 months after my conversion in that hotel room, I was publicly baptized in a small church in a safe area of Istanbul. The baptism was conducted by Pastor Mehmet, and as I descended into the water, I physically felt the weight of my old identity being washed away. All the conditioning, all the fear, all the religious performance that had defined my first 24 years, all disappeared in that moment. When I emerged from the water, I was no longer Rashid the Hafiz, Rashid the Imam's son, Rashid who had memorized the entire Quran. I was simply Rashid, beloved child of God, follower of Jesus Christ, a free man for the first time in his life. News of my conversion eventually reached Pakistan, as I knew it would. My father publicly disowned me from the mosque, declaring me dead to the family, that my name should never be spoken again in our home. My mother, broken and weeping, sent a single message through an intermediary saying that she prayed to Allah every day to bring me back to the true path, that she could not comprehend how the son she had raised in the faith could commit such betrayal. My brothers were instructed to consider me dead. The girl I was supposed to marry was quickly betrothed to another young Imam, and life in Lahore continued as if I had never existed. The pain of family rejection was profound and real. There's no instruction manual for processing the loss of your entire family, your culture, your identity, all at once. There were nights when I cried thinking about my mother, my younger brothers, my sisters who still lived under my father's control. I asked God why the path to truth had to be so painful, why following Jesus meant losing everyone I loved. But every time those doubts arose, I remembered the peace I experienced that August night, the contrast between the emptiness of my old life and the fullness I found in Christ, and I knew that even with all the pain and loss, I had made the right choice. Today, 5 years after that transformative night in Istanbul, I live a life I could never have imagined. I have completed formal theological training and now work with an organization that helps former Muslims who are questioning their faith and considering Christianity. I use my own experience, my deep knowledge of Islam, and my understanding of cultural and theological barriers to build bridges and help others make the same journey I did. Each person I help is a reminder that my own pain and loss were not in vain, that God can use even the most difficult experiences for purposes greater than we can see at the moment. I married a wonderful Christian woman named Sarah, who grew up in a family of former Muslims and fully understands the complexities of my story. Our relationship is based on mutual respect, genuine love, and shared faith in Christ, everything my arranged marriage never would have been. We have a 2-year-old daughter who is growing up knowing Jesus from the beginning, who will never have to carry the burden of a religion based on fear and performance, and who will know from a young age that she is unconditionally loved by the God who created her. There are still days when the cost of my choice feels heavy, when I see photos of my siblings' weddings on social media and realize I was never invited. When I remember the close relationship I had with my mother before everything changed, when I hear about the persecution of Christians in Pakistan and know that my own conversion is seen as betrayal by people who once respected me. But in those difficult moments, I return to the fundamental truth that changed everything. Jesus is real, His love is true, and no sacrifice is too great compared to the privilege of knowing Him personally. If you are reading this or listening to my story and find yourself in a similar position, if you are harboring secret doubts about your faith, but are afraid of the consequences of exploring those doubts, I want to say, God sees you. Jesus knows your struggle. The Holy Spirit is working in your heart, even now, drawing you to the truth. The path may be difficult and the cost may be high, but I promise that finding the real God is worth it all. The peace that comes from knowing Jesus personally, the freedom of not having to earn God's love through performance, the joy of genuine relationship instead of empty religion. These things are more precious than anything you might lose along the way. I'm not saying you should make rash decisions or unnecessarily put your life in danger. Seek wisdom. Find safe people to talk to. Honestly research both Islam and Christianity. Ask difficult questions. But don't let fear stop you from seeking truth. God honors honest seekers, and if you truly seek Him with an open heart, I promise He will reveal Himself in a way you can't deny. My prayer for you today is that you experience the same transformative encounter with Jesus that I experienced in that hotel room in Istanbul, that you know the peace that surpasses all understanding, that you discover that God is not distant and demanding, but near and loving, that you find the courage to follow the truth no matter where it leads you, and that you experience the glorious freedom that comes from being a beloved son or daughter of God through Jesus Christ. Where are you now on your own spiritual journey? Are you carrying doubts you're afraid to admit? Are you performing religious rituals that no longer touch your heart? Are you searching for God but not finding Him where you expected? Perhaps today is the day when you, like me, finally allow Jesus to enter your confusion and bring clarity, enter your fear and bring peace, enter your search and reveal Himself as the answer you have been seeking all your life.